Welcome to the Institute of Employment Rights podcasts on the manifestos. So today I'm here to talk about working time and the treatment of working time regulation in the various manifestos that have been published by the main political parties. So before I talk about the manifestos and the detail in the manifestos, I think it's worth beginning with some background to working time regulation. So if you look at the history of international labour law, working time emerges as the kind of first and most central issue of international labour law. So the founding of the International Labour Organization, the very first ILO Convention number 1 of 1919, was concerned with hours of work in industry. And there you get the emergence of this idea of 48 hours as the appropriate limit on weekly working time. So there, right at the outset, working time regulation really is kind of treated as central in the regulation of the employment relationship. Now, currently in the United Kingdom, working time is regulated through the Working Time Regulations 1998, and those regulations implement the Working Time Directive from the EU. Many workers will be familiar with the main provisions. So there's a 48-hour maximum working week, so the right not to work more than 48 hours. There are provisions on rest periods, daily rest period, weekly rest period, and in-work rest breaks. And finally, there's a right to paid annual leave of 4 weeks. And there's an extensive body of case law that's built up around the right to paid annual leave. And that is the kind of basic structure of the directive, and that provides the basic structure for UK labour law. Now, there are 3 observations, I think, that we should make on the European regulation of working time. The first is that the provisions in the directive are envisaged as minimum standards. In no sense should they be considered as a ceiling of protection. They're offered as a floor of protection. And actually many of the provisions depend upon supportive structures in member states. For example, structures of collective bargaining for the implementation of many of the standards in the Working Time Directive. So that's the first point. The directive is a floor, not a ceiling. The second point is that it's important for us to be suitably critical of European working time regulation. So many of the provisions in the Working Time Directive are subject to extensive derogations and opt-outs. Most notably, of course, the right not to work more than 48 hours per week. So the UK has taken advantage of an opt-out provided for in the directive, which allows for individual waiver of the 48-hour maximum. And that can be presented in the contract at the inception of the contract on a take it or leave it basis, which means that for many of the most vulnerable, the opt-out is really not an option if you want the job. The final point is that the Working Time Directive does not regulate pay. It regulates working time. Because the EU does not have competence to legislate on pay in member states. And I think that can be problematic because if there's a reduction of working hours with no corresponding increase in pay, that is or maintenance of pay even, that's likely to be experienced as a material hardship by the workers who are subjected to the restriction on working time. So I think that's another important part of the context. With that in mind, that kind of enables us to see why the context currently in the United Kingdom, if we look at working practices, are less than satisfactory. So if we look at TUC research, recent research, British workers are working the longest working hours in the EU at 42 hours. And that means that for full-time employees in the UK, on average, they are working more than 2.5 weeks per year more than the average EU worker. So there is a long-standing problem in the United Kingdom with long and unhealthy working hours, and that's fully borne out by the statistics. So in Germany, full-time employees work on average 1.8 hours per week less than those in the UK. And despite working fewer hours, 14.6% more productive. And in Denmark, which is the EU country with the shortest hours, workers' our productivity is 23.5% higher. And I don't think that those figures are coincidental. The fact is that long working hours are historically associated with low productivity, where employers are forced to shorten their working hours. They will be incentivized to think about more productive ways of organizing their working practices. So I think that's an interesting perspective when we factor in the productivity levels in the UK and the correspondence between low levels of productivity and long working hours. And in some sectors, the figures are particularly stark. So, for example, in The Guardian recently, it was reported that 25% of school teachers work more than 60 hours a week. And I think on any view, we would regard that as unacceptable. We must remember that at EU level, the Working Time Directive is a health and safety measure. And 60 hours a week is way in excess of the threshold of 48 hours that has been identified as necessary for health and safety. So that's the current context in the UK. That's the context that we see even where we have EU regulation of working time. So if we begin to look at the manifesto commitments, and we start with the Lib Dems, there's nothing specific about working time regulation in the Lib Dem Manifesto. And in many ways, this probably is a reflection of the Lib Dem wider commitment to remain in the EU. And perhaps the view was taken that it would be sufficient for the Lib Dems to be silent on working time, provided that they were explicit about their commitment to remain in the EU, with the EU working time protections in place. Now, I think the problem with that position has already been exposed when we look at the current position in the UK. Even with the Working Time Directive, we have excessive working hours. That's attributable to the fact that the Working Time Directive has many opt-outs and derogations and is a minimum standard. So I think it's not sufficient, actually, just to entrust working time regulation to EU regulation. Even if one is committed to the EU, one has to think creatively about building upon the floor set by EU social rights. It's a floor, it isn't a ceiling. And I think that represents a misconception in the Liberal Democrat approach to thinking about working time. So at the other end of the spectrum, of course, we have the Conservative Manifesto. And the Conservative Manifesto is silent on the question of working time, and that shouldn't surprise us. If we think about the position of many of the hard Brexiteers in the Conservative Party, the one instrument that really gets these people hot under the collar and foaming at the mouth is the Working Time Directive. That's always been a complete mystery to me. The Working Time Directive is, on any view, a modest instrument that allows the parties a great deal of flexibility, maybe too much flexibility, in fact, to vary the standards, to opt out of the standards. And I'm sorry to say that I think the Conservative approach to working time regulation is really looking forward to a day where the Working Time Directive can be removed from domestic influence, and then we get back to a situation where we were in the early part of the 20th century, where there is no statutory regulation of working time or paid holidays. And in fact, even worse than that, there would be no corresponding collective bargaining coverage. So even though we had very light statutory regulation of working time in the early part of the 20th century, there was at least strong collective bargaining in many industries. I think in the Conservative vision, we would be back to a situation where it was simply left to the law of the marketplace to set working time protections, and that would be inadequate. So I think the two manifestos that have more promise are the Green Party manifesto and the Labour Party manifesto on working time. So if we start with the Green Party manifesto, there is a commitment in the manifesto to move away from a consumption-based formulation of GDP and thinking about human and ecological well-being. And that would include work-life balance and quality of life issues. And of course, working time and decent working time would be central to that overall vision of economic policy. The Green Party manifesto is committed to working towards a shorter working week and better work-life balance. And importantly, the manifesto identifies the significance of pay to working time issues. So moving towards a shorter working week and better work-life balance should not lead to a loss of pay. And I think that's a very, very important insight. And I think that also identifies a gap in European working time protection, where there is a focus on the work dimension of the wage-work bargain, but there is silence on the question of the wage. And we have to think about working time in an integrated way. And we have to think about how it connects to wage regulation in order to regulate it effectively. So finally, I think we see the most detail on working time regulation in the Labour Party manifesto. And there are a number of provisions here which are interesting and laudable. So there is a commitment to reduce the average full-time weekly working hours to 32 across the economy, with no loss of pay, and with that funded by productivity increases within a decade. And that isn't fanciful when you look at the figures from other EU countries where there is a commitment to humane and decent working time. And we've already discussed the situation in Germany and Denmark, where average weekly working hours are shorter and correspond to much higher levels of productivity. So it's interesting that this proposal really is not outlandish, it's not a fairy tale, it's located very much within the mainstream of social democratic approaches in mainland Europe. There's a commitment, and I think an important commitment, to end the opt-out provisions in the EU Working Time Directive. This would be extremely important in ensuring that the Working Time Directive actually does function as a floor by preventing individuals from waiving their right not to work more than 48 hours per week. So I think this is a really interesting example where the manifesto recognises the value of the Working Time Directive, but also the limitations of the Working Time Directive and the need for it to be supplemented by regulation at the national level. There is also a commitment to set up an independent Working Time Commission, which would advise on raising minimum holiday entitlements and reducing maximum weekly working time. And I think that's a very, very interesting proposal, and interesting. We might think about that alongside the Low Pay Commission. So here we would have a Working Time Commission that was looking at the other dimension of the wage work bargain, drawing upon representatives from industry, making use of relevant expertise to think in a deliberative way about the future of working time in different sectors. And alongside that, sectoral bargaining councils would negotiate reductions in working time. And I think that would enable working time arrangements to be negotiated creatively on a sector-by-sector basis. An hour spent in a university office reflecting upon the working time provisions in different manifestos is not the same hour that might be spent in a foundry, or might be spent cleaning, or might be spent undertaking other tasks in different sectors. So I think it's very valuable for a working time regime to be able to think in a differentiated way about sectoral differences, about the experience of time by workers in different sectors, and also being responsive to the economic needs of employers in different sectors. And by giving sectoral institutions a role, it allows working time regulation to be contextualised, rather than it being postulated as a one-size-fits-all standard, which might not be the most helpful form of regulation. The commitment also in the manifesto is to increase productivity and to invest in increasing productivity. So alongside reductions in working time, there has to be investment in technology and thinking creatively about how to organise productive processes so that work can be done more efficiently in less time. The manifesto is also committed to keep restrictions on Sunday trading in place, to review unpaid overtime, and to introduce 4 new bank holidays that would be in addition to the existing set of paid holiday entitlements. So here you have a vision of national law building upon the existing protections in European law. And I think on balance, looking across the manifestos, I think it's the Labour Party manifesto that builds upon the work of the Institute of Employment Rights that has the most creative and the boldest approach to rethinking working time regulation in the 21st century. It was there in 1919 as one of the most basic issues. In 2019, the regulation of working time is still absolutely central, and I think its importance is given proper recognition in the Labour Party proposals. Thank you.